Hi and welcome to Gender. We're now looking at our first chapter, and we kind of begin with a little bit about, so why study gender, culture, and communication? We are regularly exposed to media and media's regular offer on advice and commentary on the subject of sex and gender. In movies, social media, news, in most other media-related platforms can and do influence our point of view related to sex, sexuality, and gender. Now, generally, students have had a big influence on the movement of gender courses in communication because they've made high demand for it. Now, students are eager to understand about sex and gender. Learning to better understand the relationship between gender, culture, and communication can be empowering for us in our personal and professional life. So we're going to look at research on gender. The communication and culture has been ongoing for some time. However, it wasn't until the 1980s that gender and communication and culture has been growing as an interdisciplinary research. There we go, got it out. In 2006, the first handbook on gender and communication was published. Now that seems like way too recently on something as big and as important as gender, communication, and culture. Research on gender takes place in many academic fields, and researchers use a variety of methods and perspectives to study gender. We will review these in this week. Now, why would we want to learn about communication, gender, and culture? Well, studying these topics serves important goals. Learning about gender helps you understand how culture influences our understanding of who we are and who others are. Studying gender and cultural communication patterns help you gain insight about your own beliefs and communication patterns, so that you may make informed choices about who you would like to be and how you would like to interact with society. Your effectiveness as a communicator will be increased as you learn and to understand and adapt to a diverse variety of communication styles. So let's get started by first introducing the topic of sex, gender, culture, and communication. The theoretical approaches is where we're going to begin, and in order to do that, we need to find out how do we gather this information. And so there are qualitative and quantitative approaches to gathering information. The quantitative research methods gather data that can be quantified. That means it can be counted. You need to have discrete, observable, countable. So you got to be able to see it and hear it in order to count it. So once they quantify and analyze data to draw conclusions. Now, more common quantitative methods, the more common quantitative methods, descriptive statistics, looks at and describes populations. Surveys, written or oral, looking at thoughts and attitudes, and experiments, studies of the relationship between variables, control and experimental, to observe the outcome. That's quantitative approach to research. Qualitative approach to research is more interpretive. Methods aimed to understand the nature or meaning of experiences that cannot be quantified. You can't count people's point of view in the same way that you can count the number of times a person reaches for a glass of water. Okay, so textual analysis or studying communication in text, like in books, magazines, is also known as ethnography, an extensive observation of diverse people, cultures, discovering patterns. And so qualitative and quantitative are two different prongs or approaches to understand these complex topics. So critical research methods as a topic. Well, identify and contest inequities and problems in social life and offer insight into ways unwelcoming environments can be created within organizations. And so a mixed research method, or a combination of two or more methods previously described, also useful to combine and get multiple types of information. So the idea is, because of the complexity of the topic and some built-in biases historically, using a multiple prong approach helps break down some of those biases, as well as give multiple perspectives to better understand the information in the topics. Cultural views of gender are in transition. Today, we may be confused or conflicted regarding gender issues about which people prior generations had a more clear-cut view. So what do I mean by confusing attitudes? Well, we probably don't prescribe to our grandparents' ideals in terms of men and women, gender, sex. We are likely confused about the gender issues insofar as, on the one part, we think men and women are equal, and we will often say that in a public environment or in a classroom, men and women are equal. And yet on another level, we may hold some of the traditional views and beliefs where we might say, well, no, that's a man's job, or no, that's more women's responsibility. So are we equal, or are we divided with responsibilities about inequity? And so therein lies some of the confusions we might in fact be a part of in today's world. So let's look at the differences between men and women. Now we're going to begin with considering the genetic difference between a man and a banana, or for that matter, a human and a banana, where there's about 50% similarity of genetic material. Did you ever imagine that a banana and a person would be similar 50% genetically? So if you think about it that way, well, what's the difference between a man and a chimp? Well, you know what? That's less than 2% genetic differences between a man and a chimp. And look at what that 2% did. And therefore, how much can there be between a man and a woman? Well, actually, there's less than 1%. Much of the differences are constructed by society, language, and culture. Not as much by genetics. I mean, such a small amount between men and women, and yet such a very big a difference in how we're treated and how each other is treated in society. Society, culture, and language is a big part of what separates us between men and women. It's difficult to find language to discuss patterns of gendered communication. Men and women, women and men, troublesome terms. It implies that we can all be grouped together, all men over here and all women over here, and we'd be able to do that pretty straightforwardly. Pop psychology suggests that men and women are inherently and distinctly different. Has that been your experience? Are we all that different? Are there similarities? Are there times when we are the same and other times when we're different? The difference between men and women are not solely biological and natural. They also may be related to culture, experience, hereditary, economic class, race, sexual identity. There's a term that's in your text. It's called essentializing, and it occurs when we assume that all members of a group, like all men and all women, are the same, and it ignores the individual variation and differences among members of the same sex. Now, while your textbook discusses generalizations about women and men, it's important to remember that there are no essential qualities possessed by all members of a sex. The differences between sex and gender and the definitions of gender and culture are important to understand. Gender, culture, and communication. So what's the relationship between gender, culture, and communication? Sex, gender, sexual orientation, culture, communication are all interrelated. We can't study one without understanding the others. Sex and gender are related concepts, but they are not the same. And this is an important first step. Sex is a designation based on biology. Sex is based on biology, and it's assigned from birth. Whereas gender, it's socially constructed and expressed. It includes gender identity, one of the internal senses of what it is to be a man and what it is to be a woman, or neither. Gender expression, the external communication of one's gender identity, and gender role, the cultural expectations assigned to one's sex. It's much more complex as a gender than it is of sex. Sex is kind of fairly straightforward, but we'll see. It's maybe not quite as straightforward as you think. So let's begin with sex. Sex is based on the external genitalia and internal sex organs, and these are determined by chromosomes. Now, most people have 2 sex chromosomes, which produce female, XX, or male, XY. Now, for every 500 people, 1 does not have either XX or XY sex chromosomes, meaning around 600,000 people in the United States do not have XX or XY chromosomes. The demographic representation in Canada is very similar. Chromosomes can vary. You could have XO, XXX, XY, and XYY, which suggests that biologically there are actually more than 2 sexes. Some born with biological characteristics of each sex historically have been called hermaphrodites. Today the preferred term is intersexed. So hormones are also a big influence on sexual development of both male and female sex organs and how our bodies develop throughout our lives. Hormones influence development. For example, fetuses with Y chromosomes bathed in androgens develop male sex organs. Fetuses without Y have fewer androgens and therefore support the development of female sex organs. Now, this is where it gets kind of interesting in a sense. Fetuses, female fetuses, where they are exposed to excessive progesterone and therefore may not develop female genitalia. Male fetuses that might be deprived of progesterone, then male genitalia may not develop. And so there's a lot hinging on hormones and the development of sexual genitalia and sexual organs. Now, biology influences how we develop but doesn't determine behavior or personality. The environment has also got a lot to do with our development generally as human beings. So let's look at gender. Gender is neither innate nor necessarily stable. It's much more fluid, and we'll see that as we discuss this a little bit more, especially throughout the course. Gender varies throughout time, geography, within the individual person, and within relationships. Consider Canada and the United States. Masculinity is associated with strength, ambition, rationality, and emotional control, whereas femininity, well, it tends to be related or associated with physical attractiveness, nurturing behavior, and concern with people in relationships. So what we can, because those aren't genetically imposed to bring those attributes out, gender is learned. Cultures will stipulate the social meaning and expectations of each sex. So we tend to see society's view of gender as normal. We learn from other cultures what is to be masculine, and we learn from our culture, that is to say, what is it to be masculine, what is it to be feminine. Now, the conventional view of both sex and gender are challenged by transgender and gender non-conforming people. Role models can also embody alternatives to traditional gender identities. A term that's used is androgyny. And now this combines the qualities of our culture, of what our culture considers to be both feminine and masculine qualities, into one person. The meanings of gender are arbitrary. What is meant by that is that the different cultures have drastically different conceptions of masculinity and femininity. Body ideals for men and women change by time, culture, and geographic location. We might value in men muscularity, and with women, thinness. In other cultures, different body types are desired culturally. And therefore, it's a cultural depiction of what is masculine and feminine, not biological. Body ideals for men and women change over time, culture, and geographical location. Some cultures consider gender to be changeable across a lifespan, and some recognize more than 2 genders. There are cultures that view 3 genders and 5 genders. The meaning of gender can even change over time in the single culture or social group. It's our culture that says that there are men and women and masculinity and femininity in 2 genders. Other cultures view there being a 3rd or even 5 genders. So if we consider things beyond sex and gender, there are some terms that we can consider, and cis is one, C-I-S. It's a prefix, for example, cisgender or cis woman, to designate a person who fits conventional categories or what is considered normal. Sexual orientation, well, that refers to a person's preference for romantic and sexual partners. Heterosexual people are attracted to people of different sex from their own. Gay men are attracted to men, and lesbian women are attracted to women, whereas bisexuals are attracted to both sexes. Changing views of gender and sex mean increasing recognition for people who don't fit orthodox categories. Transgender or trans individuals find their biological sex doesn't meet or doesn't match their gender identity, how they think about themselves. Sexual and romantic interests, though, don't necessarily change because the person transitions from one sex to another. There is also some people who reject the idea of being one or the other. Transgender refers to individuals who feel that their biologically assigned sex doesn't fit their true sexual identity. If a transgendered person takes hormones and or has surgery to reassign their sex, post-transition males to female, usually refer to themselves as MTF, male to female, or FTM, female to male. Most transgendered people have the same sexual preference before and after surgery. That is to say, if they were attracted to men before, they continue to be attracted to men after surgery. Now, that's not for all people who transition. I'm saying that as being by and large, but there are, of course, fluidity and variables there. You'll see on the screen there behind me, Jennifer Finney Boylan, formerly James Richard Boylan, and Jenna Telakova. They're both male to female, or FTM individuals. The other group of 3 there are FTM individuals. Transitioned men or females often gain keen insight into the gender dynamics of what their culture's life and expectations are by being in one gender and transitioning to another. They tend to get a view of what it is and what's different in either gender. So now let's touch on culture here. Culture is structure, institutions, practices that reflect and uphold social order. Now, structures would be they're the parts of a society, and institutions are those long-term enduring structures of in society that help influence us. Family is an institution, economy, healthcare, education, religion. These are all institutions, and they help us understand through our participation in them what are the appropriate practices to uphold the organization of a society and therefore make it stable. These are upheld by defining certain groups, values, expectations, meanings, and patterns of behavior as good and others as bad. Societal view of gender are communicated through interpersonal interactions, the way we interact with one another, through media, cultural traditions, gender roles, and patterns of interactions within families, ideologies, and practices of institutions. For example, women often will give up their name in marriage. Western culture is patriarchal, which means the dominant ideology, institutions, practices were created by men and implicitly value masculine perspectives and priorities. Now, our society is patriarchal, and where that comes through is our leadership is predominantly male. Law has sometimes, and in many cases, been skewed in favor of males. Leadership, government, corporate leaders, male predominantly, not exclusively, and that's changing. But our culture is still considered patriarchal. This results in a pervasive and naturalized view that the appropriate roles and behaviors for men and women, which we tend to take for granted, we seldom pause to reflect. We take for granted and we don't question, and we'll later just touch on that as how those three things become very important. Learning to question these cultural prescriptions for gender empowers you to choose your own course of action and identity. And this can lead us into communication. Communication is a dynamic process. It's not discrete steps to communicate ideas and thoughts. There aren't clear beginnings and endings. The dynamic nature of communications emphasizes its ongoing nature. Communication may influence how we think or feel and influence the future interactions that we have. Therefore, communication events do not have precise starting and precise endpoints. It's instead a process. You can begin communicating with someone today and complete the communication tomorrow without being face-to-face all the time. Systems influence how we interact and what meaning we attach to messages. More than context affects meaning. All aspects of communication are interlinked and influenced by how we feel, time of the day, place, etc. The largest system affecting communication is culture. Society's view and treatment of men and women changes over time. Now, there's two levels of communication. There's the content level of meaning, which is very literal. The words mean what they mean, and that's it. There's no interpretation. The content level is the literal meaning of the message, which also implies an appropriate response. It's precise. Whereas the second level, which is known as the relationship level of meaning, it defines the relationship between communicators by indicating each person's identity and the communicator's relationship to each other. The relationship level of meaning is particularly important in reflecting and affecting how people feel about each other. It's also how to interpret content. So it's very important because it assists with the literal and understanding context. Relationship level of meaning are important when trying to understand gendered patterns of communication. The most important level of meaning usually is the relationship level, which deals with conversation partner's right to interrupt, dismiss or discuss his or her topics or dismiss his or her topics, and to initiate their own topic. Meanings are created in the process of human interaction with symbols. And as humans, we are symbol-using creatures. Symbols are abstract, they're ambiguous, and arbitrary ways of representing phenomena which do not have inherent qualities. So symbols, letters, they are symbols. How we put letters together make words. How words are put together make sentences, and how sentences are put together and expressed give us understanding of language. They're all symbols. We give gifts for Christmas. We give gifts for birthdays. Those are symbols that represent a recognition of your birthday or of Christmas. Meaning does not exist in words or symbols themselves. We give symbols meanings. So even the symbol that we see here in North America, maybe our flag, has a particular meaning to us, but the meaning of our flag in another part of the world may have a different meaning. Not entirely different, but their view of Canada will affect the meaning of the symbol of our flag. We give symbols meaning. Symbolic communication requires reflection and thought for interpretation. Individuals, like you and I, construct construct an interpretation of communication. It's influenced by various factors. We draw on our past experience, our knowledge of people with whom we've interacted, and of other factors in the communication system. It's our differences in interpretations that are a source of our misunderstandings. We can become more effective as communicators by first, and I'm going to probably bring this up throughout the semester, ask questions for clarifications. Don't assume you know what's being expressed by somebody else. You sometimes need to ask for clarification. Secondly, check to see how others are interpreting you. Don't assume that you're clearly communicating what you mean. Ask them, how do I come across? What is it that I've said? Help me understand where I could improve what I've just communicated. Okay. What we've looked at is a quick overview of Chapter 1, Sex, Gender, Culture, and Communication. We're going to see these repeated throughout the course to help us understand how all these elements interact and create the complexity about sex and gender and the follow-up study of gender studies. I hope this has been helpful to begin. Let's keep up the good work. Bye, everybody.